Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Better Satellite World, the podcast of Space and Satellite Professionals International. I'm Lou Zaccarella. We continue today with our discussion around the complex topic of public-private partnerships. Today, we discuss PPPs within the realm of a growing, quietly menacing issue, space debris. Who is cleaning up there? Well, with us today are Maxar's Dr. Walter Scott, George John with the law firm of Hogan Lovells, and Astroscale's Carolyn Bell. Before you meet them, this series, Making Space for Space, the new public and private partnership, is brought to you by Artel. Artel, connecting with confidence. The Better Satellite World podcast is funded in part by the corporate partners of SSPI, Northrop Grumman, EchoStar Hughes, Access Intelligence, and the law firm of K&L Gates. Additional support comes from the 3,000 members of SSPI and its chapters worldwide. Thank you, SSPI. Carolyn Bell is the Director of Advanced Systems at Astroscale US. She currently works with commercial and government satellite operators to pursue new approaches to on-orbit operations. She started her career in astrobiology research. George John is an associate at the law firm of Hogan Lovells. Mr. John ensures that regulations do not disrupt innovation and investment in the aerospace and a range of industries. He advises clients on radio frequency spectrum use and orbital degree mitigation. He works with, among others, the Federal Communications Commission, International Telecommunications Union, and NOAA. Dr. Walter S. Scott is Maxar's Executive Vice President and Chief Technical Officer. In 2017, he was inducted into the industry's Hall of Fame for a lifetime of achievement. These include founding Digital Globe in 1992, which went on to be a groundbreaking business model. Dr. Scott holds a degree in applied mathematics, magna cum laude from Harvard College, and a doctorate in computer science from the University of California, Berkeley. They join me today to discuss what we are calling Let's Pick Up After Ourselves in Space. Welcome, everyone. Well, I'm going to begin with a question, and for the purposes of the audience, many of our audience members include people who are, inside and outside the industry. Let's define the current problem with space debris and the rationale for spending the time to discuss this issue within the context that we're trying to discuss it within today. Carolyn, since Astroscale is focused in this area, let me start with you. Let's define the current problem and then the rationale for, frankly, making such a big deal out of it.
Yeah, absolutely, Lou. It's a great place to start. So if we think about the space environment today, we have just under 5,000 operational spacecraft, those that are delivering services to the Earth today, or conducting scientific pursuits in space. But on top of that population, we have an additional 5,000 or so non-operational spacecraft and upper stages that delivered them to orbit. So these are objects that are not providing any active service, but do remain in the space environment. On top of that, we have an additional 25,000 or so debris fragments. So these might be pieces of spacecraft or upper stages, and these are the ones that we can observe. And what that means is generally is that they're larger than about 10 centimeters. So what we can observe from the surface of the Earth with how we are making those observations today, both optically and with radar. So that gives you about 35,000 objects. And then if we look at the objects that are too small for us to detect, so less than that 10 centimeters, the models predict around 130 million objects in space. And so very quickly, all of that math adds up to a very congested space environment. And this is problematic because any object in space, whether it's debris, a non-functional satellite, or an operational satellite, could present a collision risk to another operational satellite. And collisions in space, they happen at very high velocities, and they can be damaging and potentially completely destructive to the operational spacecraft if there is by chance a collision. And so this is a risk that the industry has been aware of for decades, but is increasingly aware of and thinking about, just because that debris population has been increasing and that threat is rising. And I would say the other element that is driving the conversation is that the orbital population is growing, right? We've seen so much innovation over the last few years, and businesses being defined that leverage smaller satellites and more of them. So over the next decade, we might see 30,000 or more satellites deployed. And so this really drastically increases the orbital population and that risk that's posed. So that sort of, I think, is around defining the problem, but why are we discussing it, right? Why do we care if these satellites are damaged? Well, I mean, to the point of what SSPI talks about, right? A better satellite world, there is so much benefit and value that is provided around the world from space-based activities. And we want to continue to be able to benefit from that. And I'm sure Dr. Scott and George can provide additional thoughts as to, what that value is and why it's so important for, our way of life and our economy to maintain access to space.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. I think it's a good way to get us started. And obviously, I want to revisit this with you. Astroscale believes there's a business there, a pretty significant business. Dr. Scott, you made an analogy that Carolyn would probably agree with. It was in a sort of a famous 2019 blog post. You made the analogy between what is happening in space today, where the commercial sector and government use of space is, as Carolyn said, accelerating like crazy, and the need for regulation of space traffic. And your analogy was the automobile. You said, and I'm quoting you here, even though the first gas-powered automobile was created in the 1880s, it took 3 decades to bring some sensibility to who had the right of way on the road with the invention of the stoplight. With that as a context, what will the first stoplights that are placed in space look like to regulate the space traffic? Who will put them there? Is Astroscale a company you would consider one of those companies? Is the government going to be a player here, or is the private sector going to drive it as part of an ESG initiative? Well, first of all, what's your take on that? And do you still believe the automobile analogy is the proper one?
Yeah, I do. And actually, it's somewhat ironic that I believe that the invention of the stoplight came as a result of a collision at an intersection that motivated the inventor to think about a better way to solve the problem. And we have seen now in the recent past a few instances of collisions in space, some of which were the Canadarm on the space station was hit by a piece of debris back in, I believe it was 2016. One of our satellites, Maxar satellites, Worldview 2, was winged by a piece of debris. Fortunately, it did not affect the ability of the satellite to operate. And so it's not a theoretical problem anymore. It is, in fact, a real issue. So yes, I believe that the analogy is appropriate. And in terms of how to solve the problem, I don't think that it can be solved entirely by industry, and I also don't think that it can be solved entirely by government. Mm-hmm. Back in 2019, we signed a letter with the Space Safety Coalition that included a set of what we think were common sense recommendations, and they boil down to number one. Stop digging. In other words, clean up, don't create more debris when you are operating your satellites. Design your satellites so that you don't leave a mess behind. The second was provide good orbital data to a centralized entity. In this case, it's the COMSPOC, the Commercial Space Operations Center operated by the DoD that was previously JSPOC, I believe is moving to the Department of Commerce, so that at least everybody knows if you're planning a maneuver where you're going to be maneuvering. The third was it's just not okay to say, well, my $100,000 satellite, I don't care if it gets hit by a piece of debris. I don't care if it runs into your $2 billion science satellite. Too bad. That's not okay. Everybody has a responsibility for avoidance. And so if you're operating above a certain altitude, we've recommended it be 400 kilometers because that's about the altitude of the International Space Station, that your satellites need to have the ability to get out of the way, to do active maneuvering with propulsion. And then the last was to prevent some script kiddie from taking control of your satellite and maneuvering it in the path of another satellite. You need to have a strongly protected, encrypted and authenticated command and control system. And so those are principles that a number in the industry have signed on to. Now, how does that get enforced? Well, I think that becomes the responsibility of governments. And in the past, the FCC had a rule that required essentially reentry of your satellites in 25 years at end of life. We think that that's frankly way too much time as the population of satellites increases. We've recommended that it be 5 years and that you plan to deorbit. If you're in low Earth orbit, you plan to deorbit within 5 years. There are a set of active discussions going on with the FCC. I suspect that George is probably prepared to talk about that. Some back and forth with industry comments on what would be a good regulatory regime for providing those stoplights in space.
Yeah. And that's a good segue to George. But before I go there, Walter, the Space Safety Coalition, again, for those who don't know, what is it, who belongs, and is China participating?
I didn't see China's signature on the letter, so I don't know off the top of my head what they've done, but they certainly have been responsible in the past for increasing the debris population through the anti-satellite test that they performed a number of years ago. In fact, that test, along with a collision between a defunct Russian Cosmos satellite and an Iridium satellite, between the two of those, they were responsible for roughly doubling the debris population in a fairly important regime in low Earth orbit.
Again, just before I go to George on the enforcement piece of this, what's the manufacturer's responsibility? What does Maxar need to do? Does it need to build some sort of encryption into a software-defined product, or how are you guys thinking about this?
So the satellites that we build have propulsion. They have the ability to maneuver. They have command links that are protected in varying degrees. Some of them are extremely well protected, depending on who the customer is. We design our satellites so that they don't blow off pieces of hardware, but that every deployable is encapsulated so that it does not create debris. So, we try to be good citizens of the space environment, and we recommend that all satellite manufacturers follow a similar principle. It used to be that many, many years ago, not all that many years ago, there would be exploding bolts that would be used for deployment, or you'd release a piece of hardware from your satellite. And that's just not a good practice. It's better to, similar to when you go hiking in the wilderness, you pack it in and you pack it out.
Yep. I remember when I was a kid, there was that great public service campaign, "Don't be a litter bug." Maybe we need to bring it back for a better satellite world, huh? Okay. Well, great. George, both Carolyn and Dr. Scott teed it up for you. Enforcement, a regulatory regime may ultimately, be one of the most significant aspects of this. What's your view? Do we need an horrific accident to move the regulations forward, or are commercial interests now and just good rational approaches being employed?
Thanks, Lou. I'm glad my previous conversation didn't scare you away from chatting again about space regulation. And I think there are two questions that you posed here, like what is happening and what can be done from a regulatory perspective. And so from the what is happening, to use Dr. Scott's example, there are a bunch of roundabouts and a number of four-way stops, and there's very little intermingling happening, between or among all those different traffic types. And so what do I mean by that? And this has been alluded to. We have individual administrations trying to develop their own regulations. Just in the United States alone, we have the FCC, which has established a number of new rules on everything from collision probabilities with large objects, with small objects, certain disclosures and coordination requirements with neighboring satellite operators, initial maneuverability requirements, tracking and data sharing. So those are established rules. It has open rules or open rulemaking on should we establish a post-mission orbital lifetime, human casualty risk assessment, should there be indemnification or performance bonds associated with successful disposal of satellites. And we're talking about the US, there's also a separate argument with other parts of the US government. Should it be the Federal Aviation Administration or Department of Defense or Department of Commerce that should be tracking this data and perhaps take a higher up role in actually trafficking space on behalf of US companies and quasi on behalf of the rest of the world, because there are no real established entities doing it otherwise. And so we have that in the United States. And if you move outside the United States, Dr. Scott already alluded to industry groups. Space Safety Coalition established best practices. We have the Satellite Industry Association, another group of probably 30, 40 satellite operators that create space safety principles.
SIA.
You have the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. They establish long-term sustainability guidelines. We have the World Economic Forum creating a space sustainability rating system. We have private companies like Astroscale and Leo Labs trying to develop new technologies that will both track and try to mitigate the amount of debris in space. And then you have research institutions like MIT's Astrodynamics Space Robotics and Controls Laboratory who've started conversations about should we have a slotting system for low Earth orbit satellites. And so you can see there are a bunch of different things happening in different silos, very piecemeal framework, if any. And right now, there's very little conversation happening amongst all these entities. Granted, a lot of them are the same private entities that might be trying to spur conversation. And so what can be done to try to make the traffic communicate with each other and create this international agreement or some kind of framework that everyone buys into? And that way, it's not just the US and just US operators are trying to assuage this issue. It's really an international problem because we're launching from everywhere. And so I really recommend folks take a look at Robin Dickey's Building Momentum. And what this paper essentially is talking about is how do we get to that international framework? And there are 4 steps that were outlined here. First is establishing domestic buy-in. The next step after that is trying to find initial partners that will coalesce with you. Step after that is trying to generate international commitment, whether it be legally binding, politically binding, or some type of voluntary informal mechanism. And then setting a target for critical mass, so focusing on relevant capabilities versus broad consensus. And just a good example, and I'll keep it short, is if you look at how US orbital debris mitigation guidelines have kind of become a somewhat norm. We had reference to the 25-year rule. That actually came from domestic buy-in, NASA and DoD collaborating in the late 90s to create debris mitigation practices. Then NASA brings that forth to the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, which consists of 13 additional national space agencies, and they created those guidelines that we all commonly reference now. And so both the IADC and UN have moved forward and try to create somewhat voluntary mechanisms or create more of a binding nature. And so you see the long-term sustainability guidelines that came out of UN Copius. And so we're starting to reach that critical mass where everyone is talking about the 25-year rule, or everyone's talking about certain very basic at this point and almost very outdated in certain sense rules. Right. But that is how we got there. And that's what we're going to need to do as much faster momentum to make sure that we can account for the proliferation of satellites on orbit.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and you've really described sort of the evolution or the confusing rise of something that looks like a set of global standards that might have some enforcement behind it from all these different alphabet soup groups and agencies. George, before I leave you on this topic, what was that document again, and who is the publisher of it so that people can access it?
Yes. It is Robin Dickey from Aerospace Corp, and it is called Building Normentum, a framework for space norm development. And it's published in July of 2021.
Okay. And we'll have that available for our members as a follow-up to this. Thanks. Carolyn and Walter, I'm going to go back to you on this. Again, George set the table. It looks, Carolyn, like there are already so many agencies and entities, trying to do the right thing, trying to create a regime for cleaning up in space. Obviously, there's something missing. What's missing, and where does Astroscale fit into this?
I think part of what's missing is in your question itself, really, is that there are many people thinking about this, but what we need to do is coalesce and really come together to build a set of norms that can facilitate the sustainable interactions in space, right? And space traffic management, awareness of what's happening in space, transparency, and again, coming back, I know I just mentioned it and George did as well, but this idea of norms of behavior in space. It's great to have conversations happening around the US and around the world, but we do need to come together and agree on how we want to move forward here and really move towards action. One of the other elements that—
What would be the first step there, Carolyn? Move forward to take action. I mean, if you could just, get a hold of all of these folks and say, look, I've got the authority now. I've been, knighted to do this. Here's what I do first.
I think part of it is understanding what's happening in space. So space situational awareness, I think, is step one, and understanding which satellites are in which orbits and which maneuvers are happening. So I think having a single system for tracking that data, for understanding collision risk. Right now, we somewhat have that in that it's provided by the US government, DoD, with the 18th. They do provide collision warnings to operators. But one of the challenges that faces, which is, I think, one of these things to overcome, is that some operators might have access to additional information, whether that is the GPS that's on board their spacecraft to have somewhat more accurate positioning, whether that is a commercial SSA provider that they have access to data. Not everyone is coming to the table with the same data set. And at the same time, not everyone is coming to the table with the same risk profile of what is a real conjunction risk that I need to maneuver my spacecraft for, and what is a tolerable risk. So I think this is one of the other things that we need to address early on, is understanding what sorts of risks do people have, and what is the point at which, the threshold at which they will make a choice to maneuver their spacecraft, and how do they coordinate that with the other player, right? If it's a piece of debris, then maybe there's no coordination, but if it's an operational spacecraft, there does need to be a conversation that happens. So how do we facilitate that?
Right. Very good. Well, Walter, I'm going to go a little off script here because, you're a builder. You're one of the great creative minds in the industry. Again, if you were to build an organization that addresses this issue based on what's out there right now, and again, you were looking at this and given the authority to do it, how would you connect the dots?
I will get to answering that question, but there are a couple of things I wanted to do to set some stages.
Please.
The first one is to follow up on Carolyn's comment about maneuvering. One of the other things that we do with automobiles, we have rules that govern how autos need to behave at an intersection. Like, for example, you go to a four-way stop, who has the right of way? In the US, it's the driver on the right-hand side. So there are some things that you could do that would establish norms of behavior that are effectively, if everybody follows the same sort of principles, then you don't have the risk of both people jumping in the wrong direction, so to speak, creating a collision. So I think there are some things that can be done to make it less likely that you end up with unintended behavior. The other point I was going to make is, we've talked a fair bit about space situational awareness, which I completely agree with Carolyn. That is a necessary component. We've talked also about how the various satellite operators or builders can stop digging, basically don't make the problem worse. But there's another piece of the problem, and that is, how do you actually make the problem better? By removing defunct satellites, removing defunct rocket bodies, actually cleaning things up. And I know Carolyn will probably want to talk about this as well. But as an example, Maxar is doing a project with NASA called OSAM-1 that is going to refuel a satellite that's on orbit. There's also the mission extension vehicle that Northrop Grumman offers. OSAM-1 also has robotic capability for grappling to a satellite. And so you can think about the technology there would enable you to grab an object in space and relocate it. But then what's the policy environment? Let's say that it's a defunct satellite or a defunct rocket body. Who has the authority to go grab it? And the rules of the open ocean, there's this notion of salvage. If the ship is abandoned by humans, it's open for salvage. That doesn't apply in space because virtually everything in space is not occupied by humans. And so needing a framework that would allow for the ability to clean things up, that's, I think, a fairly important part of this. So I think it really boils down, to answer your question, I think it really boils down to three components. One of them is common ground rules for space situational awareness and data sharing, as well as ground rules for maneuvering. The second is the principles that we articulated as part of the Space Safety Coalition. And I'll say in general, standards get developed by commercial entities. They generally don't get developed by governments. Governments end up adopting and implementing them, but they're generally developed by industry. And then the third is developing a policy framework to allow for active debris removal.
Right. Yeah, which is probably going to be the hardest part of it. George, Dr. Scott said something, he referred to the laws of the sea, and he said that's probably not going to be applicable to space. How about federal aviation rules, or is there maybe something in the laws of the sea or some other precedents, because law is built on precedents, right? Regulatory stuff that might apply here for the types of solutions that we've brought forward this afternoon?
No, that's a great observation. I've thought about this analogy. Aviation seems the most related to what we're doing in space, but the borders there are more easily delineated, right? Air traffic controllers know when your airplane comes across my border that I have control for it, and I'll make sure it makes through the airspace safely and then leaves. And it took some time, but we got there eventually.
And there's one controller, right?
There's one control. The environment, however, is a lot different in space, especially, as you said, growing number of LEO constellations that are up there, and how quickly they're moving. I don't know, any human could obviously take care of it, but obviously machine learning, artificial intelligence could potentially take over. So sometime in the future, maybe we could have some type of system like that. But for right now, I don't know that the aviation framework necessarily makes sense, aside from perhaps creating an international organization like ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. And then that's been the space industry's general issue is, we try to latch on to other precedents for other industries, and there's some similarities like maritime, like aviation, but there are nuances and complexities involved with space that just don't allow us to latch on as we need to.
Yeah. Again, I'm going to pick up on what your colleague said. Industry is going to have to sort of lead on this. I think that's probably true. Is there anything that you're aware of now with regard to Dr. Scott's sort of third point about, the debris removal regime that might lend itself to a global robotics removal standard? And that's also a question for you, Carolyn. But George, what do you think? Is there anything like that on the books?
Yes, there's a group called Confers, and I know it's not exactly spot on with what your question, but it's a consortium of execution of rendezvous and servicing operations, or Confers, as I said. And so on-orbit satellite servicing is their jam. I know they created in 2020 like a white paper or policy statement that was, I would say, it was probably 5 to 10 pages. And so, like Carolyn said, this industry has kind of coalesced. They realize that there are use cases, and we see that with Northrop Grumman. taking care of one of the Intelsat satellites, and Astroscale is starting to deploy its own satellites. And so while industry is working on that, trying to create these best practices or rules of the road, I have noticed that administrations are also taking notice too. And so the FCC recently had a rulemaking on commercial launch vehicles. But part of that rulemaking also touched upon unconventional type operations and whether they might need to have some kind of legal regime that regulate them. And so we'll see soon, if the FCC touches this at all. Outside of the FCC, NOAA has jurisdiction over these types of operations, and most recently updated its regulations that allows you to go up to another type of satellite, to take pictures of it, and also receive consent to potentially do additional operations. And so FAA might also get involved, and you might need to get a payload license. And so again, we have different acronyms trying to regulate different things, all for the good of trying to remove debris from space. And so, Congress is talking about, again, should we create a one-stop shop here? And Department of Commerce would kind of be responsible for it. And anyone with these type of rendezvous and servicing type operations could go and get a license, and that organization or regulator could create the framework that could eventually work with private industry, as Dr. Scott said, and eventually that becomes the international norm. It's around the horizon. It's definitely here.
George, just to
Go ahead, Walter.
follow up on that, the conference was mostly focused on cooperative type operations. But what happens if the satellite is defunct and the operator is out of business? Or what happens if the satellite is a rocket body, and who is ultimately the person you go to for permission to remove the spent rocket body? Is it the company that launched it? Is it the country that it was launched from? I think those are the kind of questions that the policy also needs to address.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Carolyn, in the back of my mind, I'm just terrified that there's going to have to be some sort of real horrific event to move this, 10 yards rather than, 1 yard at a time, or something like Demi Lovato is going to have to tweet how horrible it might be, and then 100 million people are going to respond. Are you finding, are there any public-private partnerships in place that are assisting Astroscale in identifying, for example, the Department of Commerce being the center of this, or is there anything like that in place? Or do you guys work on that as part of your business model?
We do. And to highlight what George mentioned about bringing up Confers, this is an entity that was stood up by DARPA. So it was the US government saying, we need to start having the conversation around satellite servicing standards and norms of behavior. And let's bring in industry to help us do that. And there's been a lot of buy-in from industry to engage in that process. And we do consistently at Confers receive requests from government entities of, hey, I'd love to see a standard around this type of capability. So could you guys work on that? And I think this is a really important interplay, because no one wants to see uninformed overregulation, right? We want to make sure that we are, as we step into this new world for us of satellite servicing with the objective of removing debris or mitigating the creation of future debris, extending the life, whatever the application is of that servicing. Let's not jump to conclusions about what is the one best way to do something or the one best way to regulate it. Let's have a ongoing dialogue between multiple industry players and with government to really figure out what that path forward should be. And so I think Converse is one example of what's been successful there. And to the point of, do we need to unfortunately experience a significant event to make progress? My hope is no. My hope is that we can start to take steps forward without that happening. And we do see agencies around the world looking to do that, looking to take responsibility for debris that they have put up in space, whether that is an upper stage or a satellite. So we are actually currently implementing a public-private partnership with JAXA, with the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency. And that is phase one of a two-phase mission that they have defined that they wanted to implement as a PPP. So phase one is designing a spacecraft that will go and inspect a Japanese upper stage that has been in orbit for about a decade to provide a contextual understanding of how it has potentially changed during that time in space, and what is its current status, and what might be the most efficient way to then remove it in the second phase of the mission. So it's an information gathering exercise to then take the first step in the world to remove a piece of debris under that PPP model. We also see
interesting.
ESA, the European Space Agency, the UK Space Agency looking to implement debris removal missions. ESA has a contract with a company called ClearSpace to do this. And so there is government movement around that. I think it'll be interesting to see how many of those are done as PPPs versus as contracts versus as other forms of relationships. But there is a little bit of momentum.
That's interesting. Walter, it sounds like those might be some best practices that in their evolutionary stage. Do you agree? And then B, does all of this ultimately, as you said earlier, perhaps find its center, its next iteration in commerce, in the Commerce Department, in industry itself?
Yeah, I don't know which government agency is the right government agency. I'm not willing to stick my oar into that particular fight. I think it's important that it be a government agency, that there not be an alphabet soup of government agencies that are atomized and each trying to do a little piece of the puzzle. So I do believe that it's necessary to find a home for it. Was that the question, or was there more that you wanted to get at?
Yeah, well, that was a significant part of it. But I also was interested in what Carolyn had just described, some of the relationships that they've got now with JAXA, for example. Do we need a series of best practices around removal and to watch how those evolve, and then to say to ourselves, yeah, these were the right players for this. Let's now scale this for an international standard for our industry?
So if you look at the way other standards get developed in the technology world, almost inevitably, they are a result of action across an industry, publication of things that work, things that don't work. There's a lot of iteration that happens. And so these early efforts, like, for example, the one Carolyn described with JAXA, the OSAM-1 mission, the mission extension vehicle that Northrop Grumman is doing, and others, I highly encourage everybody who's involved in those to publish the lessons learned. Mm-hmm. And that's a way that the industry can rapidly gravitate toward what does and doesn't work. This isn't an area where my personal view, I'm speaking just as Walter Scott, not as CTO of Maxar. My personal view is that you're going to make more progress faster if we all recognize this is a problem we all have to deal with, and that we share what we learn along the way. That will advance us far faster than everybody trying to hold everything close and not share what we've learned.
Yeah, it's well said. And there's probably a role for associations and organizations like ours to be the repository of those, or at least to keep the communication out there, which is, this sort of the last point. Just very quickly to each of you, because we have to wrap it up, but I would love to keep this going. Is there a role for the media to be more responsible, to write about this differently, to look at this more granularly? George?
I love that you asked this question. And I think in some of the initial conversations, we discussed how there's a hysteria, this common misconception that we only need to think about, the probability or the risk that something bad occurs, but really it's the probability or the risk plus the consequence of that risk. I've pointed to the study that Darren McKnight and Darren Garber did, and they're both well touted in the industry, they looked at how 175 CubeSats in low Earth orbit versus 72 Iridium satellites in a higher up low Earth orbit. The probability, or like the number of fragments that come about from collisions among their satellites, it's exponentially different. And so for I think it was like a Spire CubeSat, it was like 14 some fragments. But for Iridium, it was, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was a lot more. And so even though Iridium has fewer satellites and propulsion, you have to look at the orbit that it's in. And it's a crowded orbit because of a collision that happened years ago, and because debris just stays up there longer, as opposed to a Spire type orbit, which is self-cleansing, and atmospheric drag will bring back a lot of those fragments very quickly. And another thing, and the scientists in the group can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Kessler syndrome is a little bit overstated, and a number of movies and such have made it seem like, oh, this is going to be a really bad thing that happens. And yes, I agree that it's a possibility. And yes, like we don't even want to test those waters, but we have to remember debris would be spread over like a large volume of space, not a single orbital surface. So collisions of orders of magnitudes less likely. Most impact debris will have slower orbital velocity than either of its original pieces. And then we'll have small and large pieces, and the small objects are more affected by atmospheric drag and deorbit faster. So there are a number of different reasons why the Kessler syndrome is probably pretty far out, but we need to get ahead of it. And that's why we have this conversation here.
Right. That's very good. And the question was, is the media responsible for doing more? And of course, if they did their homework like you, that would be great. But I have to check with our Hall of Famer, and of course, always check with a Harvard guy. Walter, is his science right? Does that sound about right to you?
So some number of years ago, I was talking at the satellite conference about this problem, and said, on the one hand, you can share a statistic that said the Chinese ASAT and the Iridium collision resulted in a doubling of debris fragments in a particular orbit regime. And that sounds really dramatic. And it was. But this probability of collision was still, chance in a million or less as a result of that. So you might have doubled it from 1 chance in a million to 2 chances in a million, but it's still relatively small.
Okay.
The essence of what I think we're all talking about is it's small right now, but there are things like Carolyn talked about where you're having large populations of satellites being introduced into a single orbital regime that could make it considerably worse. And so now is the time to get ahead of the problem, as opposed to, unfortunately, the way most humans tend to operate is they wait until the problem becomes really, really bad before solving it. And it costs a lot more and takes a lot more time than if we had simply solved it when we had the opportunity to do so.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So we've got to overcome human nature, Carolyn. And with the media, if it bleeds, it leads, is the old cliche. Got about a minute, Carolyn. I'm going to let you wrap it up. But if you could get one message out through the media about this subject, about where we need to go next, from Astroscale's perspective, what would it be?
I think it would be that space is very critical for the current way that we live around the world, and we need to change the way that we interact with space so that we can not only continue to benefit from that today, but that innovators can continue to design new systems and new services so that that benefit increases moving forward, so that we have long-term sustainability and utilization of the space environment.
Very good. Thanks for the long term. Well, listen, thank you so much, Carolyn, George, and Walter. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure the audience has been right with us on this. I really appreciate you making the time for this today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Lou.
Thank you.
Well, that wraps our conversation with Carolyn Bell, George John, and Dr. Walter Scott. Again, SSPI and its members, thank them. For more information about these three companies, go to maxar.com, astroscale.com, and Hogan Lovells, that's 2 L's at the end, .com. We'd like to hear your thoughts about this series. Send your comments to Ana Gomez at agomez@sspi.org. SSPI is the voice of the space and satellite professional, a professional like these three whose work makes the world better every minute of the day. To learn more about our Better Satellite World campaign and to see how brands like Artel benefit from it, go to bettersatelliteworld.com. And if you're not a member of SSPI and would like to be, go to sspi.org. Dues are only US $100 per year, but if you're a student, your membership is free. Follow us on Twitter at SSPI and check us out on LinkedIn and on Facebook. For Space and Satellite Professionals International and our producer, Ana Gomez, I'm Lou Zaccarella. Let's make it a better satellite world. Take care, everybody. Thanks for coming.